How do we define poverty? Often we look at dollar terms. People making less than $1 or $2 or $3 a day. But the complexity of poverty really has to look at more than income as just a variable. Poverty is such a complex entity that we, being here in one of the richest countries in the world, cannot begin to fully understand it. So why does poverty matter to us? We're here in one of the richest countries in the world. How does it affect me? So let's take a step back and we'll look at a few key facts. So the first, over 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Most of the diseases that they die from are completely preventable. Millions of people in Africa are uneducated or illiterate. There are countries in Africa with less than 30% literacy rate. Over 30 million people in the world are infected with HIV and AIDS, a disease largely associated with poverty. So we read these facts and we think they're uncomfortable, they're upsetting, they're sad. We may think of ways to ignore them or simply forget about them altogether. Perhaps to some of us, poverty doesn't even matter. However, there are some of us who may think, well, how can we put an end to this? How can we stop it? How can we make it go away? The temptation is to find the one solution, that one silver bullet that's going to put an end to the problem once and for all. Let's take a look at our first statistic. Over 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. Some individual ideas about putting an end to this problem may be, well, it's simply an economic issue. Why don't we just give more aid? Why don't we raise more money for these countries? So on that notion, let's take a look at some of Africa's aid. So this is from Botswana, Africa. This is some of the aid they've received since the 1960s. The yellow line represents the aid per capita, and the blue line represents the GDP per capita. So we take a look and we see all this aid being given, but we really see the GDP staggering or suffering in a way. So how do we know how the GDP would have differed without the aid? So would it have been linear? Would have it gone down? Would it stay the same? We really don't know because there aren't multiple Africas. We can't take one Africa and say that aid is really helping, it's really helping them progress economically. We can't take another Africa and say that aid is doing no good, it's causing dependence and corruption. So what do we do with the solution? Do we simply give more and more aid and hope that something positive comes out of it? It's often argued that aid unleashes corruption and dependence. But to counter that, it's often argued that aid is necessary to eradicate poverty once and for all. The thing is, if we're not sure we're doing any good, what good are we really doing? We're no better than, let's say, doctors who are testing new cancer treatments. Sometimes the treatment works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes the patients die. Is it the treatment, the cancer? What factors played a role in their death? We simply don't know. This is just the complexity in relation to poverty. So let's take a look at some smaller questions in relation to our statistics and poverty. One of the statistics I gave you, 9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5, most of whom die from diseases that are completely preventable. So the question there becomes, how do we immunize these children and prevent these deaths? This is a significant problem. The technology and infrastructure are there in Africa, but the problem fails to be solved. Why is this? Another one of the statistics I gave you, millions of people in Africa are uneducated or illiterate. There are countries in Africa with less than 30% literacy rate. So the question there becomes, how do we educate these people? Do we hire more teachers, build more schools? How do we really do it? And one of the other statistics I gave you, over 30 million people in the world are infected with HIV/AIDS, a disease largely associated with poverty. 2/3 of the world's populations that are infected with HIV/AIDS are located in Africa. So the question here becomes, how do we prevent the spread of this disease? The thing is, the big question I raised earlier about aid is one I cannot answer, and probably many people cannot answer and will not be able to answer for many years to come. However, the 3 questions in relation to our statistics can be answered. So let's take a look at our first statistic or problem. How do we immunize? It's really not because the vaccines are not in third world countries. They are there, and they generally are free. It's also not because parents don't care about their children. So what is the real problem here? Part of the problem is that people do not fully understand the concept of immunization. They lack knowledge about diseases, and they do not have the education or knowledge of disease prevention itself. I'll come back to this point when we cover education further. However, another part of this problem is making the transition from intention to action. If you live 10 miles from your nearest immunization center, what incentive do you have to walk 20 miles in a single day to immunize yourself or your family from something you have no idea what it is? So why am I going to walk 20 miles and suffer that pain just to prevent myself, just to prevent malaria when I don't know what malaria is? I have no real understanding of it. What incentive do I have? So how do we fix this problem? I'm going to show you an experiment done by World Vision. Here we have a series of camps that were set up by World Vision. They were set up in sub-Saharan Africa. The blue camps represent regular immunization camps where people can go to immunize themselves from malaria and get condoms to prevent HIV, etc. And the red camps represent immunization camps that will provide you a kilo of lent beans if you go and get yourself immunized. So there's incentive to go and do that. So here's the visual representation. Blue is the regular immunization, and red is the immunization with incentives. So let's see the results. The immunization camps with no incentive went from a 2% immunization rate to a 17% immunization rate. That's good, but let's see the camps with incentives. The camps with incentives went from nearly a 0% immunization rate to a 38% immunization rate. So here's one simple solution to our problem. Incentives do lead to immunization. This is a simple solution that we can take a look at further. But let's take a look at our second problem. How do we educate? There are plenty of methods in which we can educate the impoverished. We can explain the benefits of education, hire more teachers, and provide health services or other incentives for getting an education. Realistically, all of these options are viable and should work in one way or another. However, one of the most considerable issues lies within what is being taught. As I stated earlier when I was talking about immunization, part of the problem is that people do not fully understand the concept of immunization itself. Immunization from the disease is due to, or not being immunized from diseases, is a lack of education and knowledge of disease prevention. Now this kind of turns into a moral argument. What takes priority in education? Teaching academics in accordance with the Western world in order to build a strong workforce and kind of expand on their economies to get themselves out of poverty? Or are we going to save lives by teaching them about immunization and prevention from diseases like malaria and HIV? So first we must create an education grounded in the idea of prevention. Academics will have little value to terminal children, so it's not so much about how we educate, but what we educate. Realistically, there's an array of options to promote education in third world countries. It's just about teaching the correct materials. So let's take a look at our third problem. How do we prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS? Our third problem links directly back to the problem of education. Again, just like I talked about in education, we must educate children with the correct material. The effect that HIV/AIDS has on South Africa is devastating. So I'm going to cover some of these effects. The effect of life expectancy. In many countries of sub-Saharan Africa, AIDS has erased decades of progress made in extending life expectancy. The average life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa is now 54.4 years, and in some of the most heavily affected areas, it's less than 49 years. The effect on households. The effect of AIDS on households can be very severe, especially when families lose their income earners. In other cases, people have to provide home-based care for sick relatives even when they're living in poverty. Reducing their ability to earn income plays a really dark role. Many of those dying from AIDS have surviving partners who are infected and in need of care as well. They leave behind orphans with no one to take care of them. The effect on healthcare. In all affected countries, the HIV/AIDS epidemic is putting a strain on the healthcare systems. As the epidemic develops, the demand for care of those living with HIV and AIDS rises, as is the number of healthcare workers affected. The effect on schools. Schools are heavily affected by AIDS as well. This is a major concern because schools can play a vital role in reducing the impact of the epidemic through education and support. The effect on productivity. The HIV and AIDS epidemic has dramatically affected labor, which in turn slows down economic activity and social progress, and puts further strain on the healthcare system. Most individuals suffering from the disease are between the ages of 15 and 19 and in the prime of their working lives. The effect on economic growth and development. The HIV and AIDS epidemic has already had a significant impact on Africa's economic development, and in turn has affected Africa's ability to cope with the epidemic, as it places much strain on economic activity and social progress, as mentioned previously. Ultimately, the impacts are devastating. HIV and AIDS can also be prevented not only through education, but prevented through the use of condoms. Condoms play a key role in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and they've seen a large increase in condom use in recent years. The distribution of condoms to countries in sub-Saharan Africa has also increased. The target for the region is 13.9 billion condoms, which requires less than $1 billion, a very small amount of money on a global scale. So after looking at some of these problems and their potential solutions, we begin to understand that the issue of poverty is not all it's made out to be. It's extremely complex. The problem of aiding those in poverty is that we don't always know we're doing the right thing. There is no silver bullet that will solve all the problems that poverty offers or involves. We cannot simply take people out of poverty, which is very frustrating. But let's take a look at the issues we've looked at. So we've looked at very simple solutions to very complex problems. We cannot eradicate poverty just yet, but perhaps if we start small, we can begin the process. Eradicating poverty will not be an easy task. It's slow and frustrating, but there is no other way. There really is no silver bullet. However, we can now return to the bigger question I raised at the beginning. I don't know that the aid we are providing is making a difference, but we can look back in a number of years and ask ourselves, has what we've done prompted change for the better? And I believe we can. Thank you.